This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where I have a returning guest, Jake Rayson. We're talking about wood meadows, or rather, we're talking around the periphery of wood meadows as a concept. We're talking about the use of land, gardens, humans and wildlife, and generally getting a bit ranty about the absolute state of things. I realise that's not much in the way of an introduction, but the conversation twists and turns, and the best thing to do is just take a listen.
I came into forest gardening maybe 10 years ago, and really it was based on a desire to do something practical about the nature and climate emergency. And what I've learned over the past few years is, firstly, that gardening is just one small part of a bigger picture. And if you get into wildlife gardening, that becomes more interesting because then you're not doing things just for humans. You're actually caring about the wider environment. And the work that you do then impacts other living creatures. It's a good place to start from, but I don't think it's everything. We need to extend the ideas about nature recovery and human actions. We have to expand that out into the wider landscape. So I started work at Ceredigion County Council as a biodiversity assistant, and my job is to assist biodiversity wherever I can. And as part of the remit I have is to set up a meadows group. So then I started reading about meadows and finding out more about how they're constituted and the different types of meadow and the differences between meadow and pasture. And somebody mentioned wood meadows, and I'd heard about them before. There's a woman called Linden Hawthorne who has designed a wood meadow up in Yorkshire, Three Hagges Wood Meadow, which is now managed by Plantlife. So I've been in conversation with her about wood meadows, and essentially they're meadows, so they're cut for hay once a year and possibly lightly grazed, but they also have tree cover as well. So the tree cover range is from anything from 10% to 50, up to maybe 60%. But what is very interesting about wood meadows, it's the actual management which increases the biodiversity. And this is absolutely critical. Human intervention can generate more biodiversity, create more life. And I think this is what we need to do in the face of a nature emergency that we have. Just the number of species, and I think in Wales it's 1 in 7 species is facing extinction, which is just off the charts. And what's happening is this trajectory does not show any sign of stopping either. So what we really have to do as a society, as a species, is to look at what does work, look at what can actually create more biodiversity, and then use those models and explore those models and experiment with them. And this is what a wood meadow is. But what I found really interesting as well, coming back to the gardening aspect of it, was that it's really similar to forest gardening. A forest garden is an edible ecosystem. It's like a very, very short definition of it. And in a cool, temperate climate that we have, you're using different layers of edible trees, crops, so fruits and nuts and leaves and shoots. And then you have edible shrubs, berries, and then herbaceous perennials, perennial vegetables. But that really is, that model, that idea of the woodland edge, is essentially what a wood meadow is as well. So the idea of a wood meadow is extending that forest garden out into the landscape. So yeah, that's been a bit of a journey, and it feels like the journey's starting again. And the fundamental question that we've got to look at is, it's the economic system which is driving the rise in carbon emissions, but it's also driving the degradation of nature. And that has to be addressed, but that has to be addressed at scale. We can't just concentrate on individuals' gardens. It's a very, very important part because it's a pathway into nature for most people and reconnecting with nature. But we also have to look at the wider landscape and the wider kind of economic implications of a farming system that is based solely on profit. So that needs to change. And I think a wood meadow is just one way and one way in where we can challenge that status quo and look at more sustainable and resilient methods of growing food.
So you were messaging me and saying, wood meadows, wood meadows, wood meadows. And I was saying to you, well, what is it? Surely it's just a clearing and a bit of wood, isn't it? Like, I don't get it. I don't see how it's a meadow if it's in a wood. So can you just, for anyone who's a bit like me, or maybe being a bit obtuse, could you just explain exactly what a wood meadow is?
Well, it is exactly that. It is a clearing in a wood. That is the kind of defining characteristic of it. And it is like one of the oldest ways of managing land. So there's a fantastic book called Tending the Wild by Kat Anderson, which is about indigenous Californian land practices. And I think you still got a copy of that, haven't you? Have you read that yet?
I've still got the copy. I can neither confirm nor deny if it's on my table unread at this point. I have definitely started it.
And there is some amazing stuff in there. It is like forest gardening. It is agriculture insofar as you're encouraging certain plants to grow, but it's not intensive agriculture. And I think this is the kind of key difference here. So you can grow grass in and around trees, and you can cut it for hay, and you can do that very effectively. You can get a crop from it. But the issue is that it's not economically sustainable. It's ecologically necessary, but it's not economically sustainable. If you just look around, I mean, I don't know what it's like down in Sussex, but you look around West Wales and you have huge, massive, great big, I don't know, 3, 4 meter tall tractors with sprayers and harvesters and cutters, which are about 10, 15 meters wide. They're absolutely massive, but they can't get into small spaces. So you've got to have large fields, and you have large fields, then that's straight away you're getting rid of all the hedgerows. And then if you want to increase the return on your crop, then you need to spray it with herbicides and pesticides and spread slurry all over it. And that's how you increase the amount of nutrition in the grass that you're cutting. But that just totally wipes out any diversity. So it's the economic model which is forcing the degradation of nature. So you can have viable agricultural systems, but it has to be supported economically as well.
I can tell you what Sussex is like. It's a disgrace, actually. Having been to other parts of the country, I don't know what is going on in Sussex, but we are so impoverished in terms of plants and wildlife. Actually, it's an utter disgrace. So if anybody's listening from Sussex, and they're the people who are responsible for mowing down the orchids when they're in full flow and doing all the sorts of stupid things that just rip the arse out of our landscape, it's noticed. It's just disgraceful where I am. I can't tell you how cross it makes me when I look at it. I went up to the Peak District and it was beautiful. I don't know what we're doing down here, but anyway, that's me on my soapbox. And all of that aside, yes, I totally agree. We have like meadows here on the site where I work, and we can't get them cut because no one will come in because they're too small to do it. It's just not viable for people to come in and cut them for hay. So we ended up having to find all sorts of workarounds to manage the land. And that is the thing, I suppose. Are you proposing that these things take place on private land or public land? And are you saying that actually in order to make this happen, we need to take the hit economically, we need to find more people to work the land, we need to find different ways of using it and seeing it as valuable rather than monetary? How does this work going forward?
I don't know is the short answer. But this is the question. But this question, there's a fantastic book called The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow. And it's about, again, it's about the relationship between European colonists and the indigenous people and the difference in kind of philosophy and outlook. So the indigenous cultures in North America have been thriving for 10,000 years, and the Europeans go over and have messed everything up in 200-300 years. So something has gone wrong with the way that we approach life, the way that we approach the economy, the way that we grow food, the way that we create stuff. So David Graeber says in the book, this is the time to ask big questions. But it's not just down to one person. I'm a gardener, I'm a designer, I don't know that much. It needs everybody on board, and it needs everyone to ask difficult questions. At the moment, I don't know if you've noticed, there is a general election going on. But what's being offered is more of the same. It's neoliberal, austerity driven. It's all about money. It's all about the bottom line, rather than using the power that you actually have as a nation, as a group of individuals, as communities, to bring about change, because it can be done. And I think this is what's so interesting about wood meadows, is they can act as a model for this change. You can do this. Humans can have an effect on their environment and increase biodiversity. John Little, gardener John Little, is a classic example of that. If you look at his work, and this is why he's so inspirational, he is increasing the biodiversity in his gardens, not just through planting. And his point is that if you look at the brownfield sites, at the old industrial sites, These are some of the most biodiverse nature reserves that we have in the UK. And they come about naturally through this disturbance, through this interaction. And we can actually do this when we're creating landscapes, when we're doing landscaping, when we're doing gardening. Why on earth aren't we as gardeners and aren't we as landscapers just focusing in on that and being able to make this change? And then that goes on to agriculture. We can make a difference. We can do something about this. You need to tell people, you need to educate people, and we need to be able to incentivize people because farmers are getting paid. They're getting paid a subsidy. Farmers receive benefits. So why on earth aren't the benefits tied in with increasing biodiversity? There's an awful lot that can be done that doesn't cost any extra money, but there is also an awful lot of money that I think that fundamentally the economic system needs to alter. But there's a lot that can be done within the current confines of it as well. The bottom line is, oh, we can't afford this, but there isn't the money. How do we pay for this? And how can we not afford to do this? Because, you can see around you the evidence in front of your eyes in Sussex, in Wales, the decline in biodiversity is absolutely shocking, is a disgrace. And the increase, the change in the climate is barely mentioned. Just like, oh, I don't know, Pakistan and India at the moment, they've got temperatures of over 50 degrees Celsius and people are dying on the streets. And it's not even mentioned in the news. You have the biggest Category 5 hurricane hitting the Bahamas, and it's the earliest Category 5 last recorded was, I think, beginning of September. So you have these huge kind of weather events that are happening that will affect billions of people, and it's not even discussed. It doesn't even make the headlines. So this needs to alter.
Personally, I am very down on humans, and I have to say that it was interesting what you said at the start when you said gardening's kind of not everything. I'm paraphrasing you, but it's a start. Actually, the more I garden, the more I really don't want to garden. I just find it's like a war every single day to try and keep a garden in a state that is acceptable and aesthetically pleasing, and I just feel like I don't want to keep fighting everything that's trying to come in, and I feel more and more, I suppose, every day that I want to be hands off, and things will evolve as they need to evolve. And so I'm very much kind of, let's take a step back. So for me, anything where I feel as if human interaction is necessary, it jars me a little bit. I think, here we go, sticking ourselves at the centre of the narrative again. Do we need to be involved in the management of these systems in order for the biodiversity to increase?
Absolutely. What humans suffer from is, and I'm guilty of this personally as well, is hubris, is like this idea that we know best. And that really needs to alter. There needs to be a humility when you are approaching any living space. When I first started forest gardening, I went through Martin Crawford's book, Creating a Forest Garden, and I went, oh, I want that one because it's edible. Oh, I won't have that one because that's not edible, because that's just a native plant and that doesn't, what's in it for me? And that really honestly was my approach to it. And that's how I kind of first started out, rather than saying, I am part of a bigger ecosystem. I am part of the ecosystem. I am not controlling it. It's not down to me. So yes, but we do need to make an intervention, but to restore the balance that we had previously. So because we've already made an intervention, it's rather like a fruit tree, or an apple tree has already been bred to buggery, so that you have to prune it, otherwise the apple tree will suffer. Rather like breeds of dogs that you have to cut the hair, otherwise they'll die of heat exhaustion. You want to be able to pull back to that state where you don't have to intervene and it's just a light touch. That's the state that you want to be in. But there's quite a lot of intervention to get there in the first place. And that means like changing attitudes, changing ways that you work. It's got a total shift. What do they call it? It's like an ontological shift, a philosophical shift, where you're moving away from this idea of, I'm doing this, I like this is for me. And it's much more, I'm here amongst all these other living creatures. What can I do best to support everything that's around me? I'm not saying not whilst making a living or not whilst growing food, but that should be the starting point. But that's massive shift from where most people are, I believe, at the moment.
I definitely think that is true. And we spoke about it, I think, more in terms of agriculture, but is there an application for this knowledge in our current ways of gardening, or in the ways that we manage landscapes on a more, I suppose, domestic scale?
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And in the same way that when I first started forest gardening, it was all about the acres and it was all about the big 4 meter high fruit trees. But actually, it's the principles of forest gardening you can use on a smaller scale. And the principles of a wood meadow, they're using the wood meadow as a model. You can use the principles of a wood meadow on a small scale as well. And what that really, really comes down to is creating structural diversity, which is the edge of the woodland, that idea of different heights. Even when it comes to cutting the grass, the chap from Plantlife gave a talk and he was saying that even if you cut the grass like short for a walkway and then slightly longer and then let some get really, really long, and you've got 3 levels of grass, that just makes all the difference. And you rotate that and you can change it, but that makes all the difference to the species that can survive in that space. And yes, a native species is the other critical point, is native species where possible. And I am absolutely gobsmacked still to this day that when I see kind of discussions, I don't really get involved in the gardening world anymore, which is funny considering this is what I do. Most days I am doing something related to gardening, but native plants aren't like a massive, massive part of general ornamental, even ornamental gardening. Don't even want to get down the edible route. But why aren't native plants up there? Why aren't people discussing different kind of plant combinations for native plants, or even cultivating native plants? I mean, there are some that you can get, like Geranium sanguineum, for example, which is a native plant, and there's lots of cultivars of it. But this should be at the forefront. This should be, what plants can I use? What wildlife can they support? What habitat can I create? What kind of balance? That, for me, is what gardening is about. Gardening should be about life. It shouldn't be about what looks nice to humans solely.
Well, James Hitchmo's just done a talk about championing basically the use of non-native plants, so you might want to
Oh,
check that out. But yeah, I mean, you've
brilliant.
got the big kind of names in horticulture who are championing the use of ornamentals over native plants because that's, in my opinion, their bread and butter. So maybe there's a kind of reason to not focus on the native plants quite so much.
This is the really, really frustrating point. It's like with farming. If you say you talk to a farmer, I remember asking a farmer ages ago, "Oh, what type of grasses have you got in his field?" And the farmer says, "I don't know. There's perennial ryegrass and timothy and something else, and that's all I know." I'm thinking, you've been farming here for 20 years. There's rough pasture, like unsown pasture next door. There's about 30 different species of grass in here, and you don't know what any of them are. And it's like, well, if you're a farmer or if you're a gardener, then surely, as a matter of professional pride, if somebody says to you, here's some native plants, is it not like, this is something that you can work with? These are the parameters that you're working with. Don't be so lazy as to kind of fall back on, oh, this looks nice and that works well with that. It's like, think about it in a broader context, because you have a responsibility for the places that you're working in. And that applies to much as the top A celebrity gardeners as it does to your neighbor next door putting out some bedding plants or something. Yeah.
Just to pick up, that was episode 286. I think that might have been Mark Schofield you referenced from Plantlife.
Yes.
He's, former guest, Mark Schofield. So,
Oh,
yeah.
oh yeah, I must have heard him. I actually went to a talk he gave. He was brilliant. And I've been in touch with him, funnily enough, about the wood meadow up in Yorkshire. So I've got to go up there and visit at some point. It's a point as well that any of your listeners who are up in Yorkshire, it is open to the public, I'm pretty sure. So it's worth checking out. I think that the garden needs to be kind of more opened up as well, and actually acknowledge the fact that it's gardening is around humans, and that gardening is a human activity, and it's like an quote unquote artificial activity in that respect. But what we need to be doing is looking at gardening in kind of more functional terms. So you're creating spaces for humans and for wildlife and for other creatures, but it needs to be kind of responsive to its environment and take into account where it's situated and where it's located. And I really just wanted to mention a couple of books, if I can. Ursula Franklin's Real World of Technology. It is a brilliant book. She's talking about appropriate technology. And there's this real obsession in the West, and I think it's driven by capitalism. So if you look at Jason Hickel's work, Less is More, and about the idea of degrowth, but everything's focused upon more growth and more consumerism, and it's focused around the technology, increasing the technology, even if we don't need it. But rather than it being the technology supports a society, it's the other way around. The technology and the consumerist society is driving what we're doing. But it does relate to gardens. I do think it's all kind of connected. There's a book called How Buildings Learn by Stuart, which is about architecture, but it's also about how humans interact with their environment and how things change. And then there's a high road, which he describes as the grand design, and this is how things are, and this is how things work, like the Guggenheim Museum in New York. And then you have the low road, which is kind of prefab, square, rectangular buildings that are easily adapted and moved and changed, and people live in them and work in them and alter them. And I think you can take the same approach when you're gardening. Like all the really successful gardens that I know of and that I appreciate and that I like are always shifting and changing and moving. And it's kind of responding to the environment in a different way. And I came across the book by a chap called Ethan Marcotte, who's a web designer who wrote a book called Responsive Web Design. And it's about how websites respond to different screen sizes. But it's that principle of adaptability. And the kind of reason I say that as well is because we are headed for a change on an epic scale. Whatever happens, there is going to be massive, massive change. And we need to be flexible in how we respond to that. And that's like the resilience comes from diversity, from trying out different things, from experimenting with different things as well. And I think we need to start building that resilience now, rather than relying upon the fragile economic structures that we have at the moment. You have one boat blocks a Suez Canal, I think it was. It has a massive effect on the whole global economy. And events like that are going to happen more. So we really, really need to be kind of looking at things that can work locally. So this is why I think Wood Meadows is a very good model, because it's something that can work locally with communities. And then what I wanted to say about that is there's a real issue with funding that I've come across, is that all the funding for nature projects is capital funding. I think most of them are about 90% capital funding and then 10% revenue funding, or 10% funding for salaries. And that's a real problem, because anybody who works in nature, anyone who works with a garden knows you need years. You need like minimum 5 years before you start to see a new garden take shape. And it's more like 10, 20 years to really appreciate it and to understand the landscape and to understand the situation, the plants that you're working with. So my idea for the wood meadows is to create common wood meadows where you recommon the land. You're using the capital funding to buy the land and then put that in trust for that area, for the people who are working on that land, and create sustainable livelihoods. So it needs to be self-sustaining. Again, one of John Little's main points about gardening is there's never the funding for management. There's never the funding for someone to look after it properly. So what we need to do to address that at the moment is to set up the framework, get the infrastructure in place, and then make sure that the livelihoods, that whatever they are, whether it's coppice working or whether it is a farmer mowing it, or whether you've got pasture on there, or it's an orchard, or it's a play area, or there's a whole range of different activities that can generate income. They then need to be set up in advance so that the land can be managed. Otherwise, it will fall into disrepair, disuse, and then it will be less biodiversity. As soon as you actually have that human interaction, that light touch human interaction comes out, that's when you start to see a drop in the biodiversity. And that's the studies that have been done. Oh, there's a fantastic paper called When Culture Supports Biodiversity, the Case of the Wooded Meadow, by Kull, Kukk and Lotman, 2003. And that's the point they make in the paper, is that when that human engagement is taken away, that's when you see a drop in the biodiversity. It's actually that light touch management that increases that biodiversity.
We recorded this podcast on the day of the general election, and by the time it airs, the results will be in, and we'll have the same old, or a new bunch running our country. Whoever it is, I can guarantee they won't solve the problems we're facing, and you're wasting your time if you think they can. Change starts at the level of the individual. We need to make grassroots changes instead of wasting breath debating the merits of whichever group is in power. It's a terribly overused phrase, but I'm not sorry to use it. Be the change you want to see in the world. Be the bloody change. Do something useful to bring about change. Don't wait for other people to do it. They're not going to. I know I'm being ranty today, but I don't do it very often now, so please indulge me. Thank you very much to Jake for being a guest and a big supporter of Roots and All from the start. And thanks to you as well for listening. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.